I watched a video about how to begin a presentation, and the advice I got was to start with a shocking fact. Here's my shocking fact. The history of the United States is of one people making a future for themselves by foreclosing another's. This is a deep dive into the real history of the USA. Let's get right into it. Chapter 1, The Age of Exploration. The Italian sailor for Spain, Christopher Columbus, arrived in the Caribbean in 1492. He believed he had reached Asia, so he called the natives on the islands Indians. And here is his 4 voyages. So right here in the Caribbeans. He claimed to have discovered a new world full of riches, but indigenous people had lived in the Americas since at least 23,000 years before his arrival. And we're going to talk a little bit about native origins. So, when people had spread out from Africa into Asia and then Europe and eventually across from modern-day Russia to modern-day Alaska, natives had populated the entire Western Hemisphere. So a few of the major ones we have is the Aztec Empire. That alone is 5 to 6 million people. And then the Incas here, that's 12 million people. And then we have a lot of tribes in the United States. Native tribes built civilizations in pyramids, played sports, hunted, fished, and had cultures and religions. But they possessed land that Europeans wanted. The Native American city of Cahokia in modern-day Illinois. And here is a modern photo. The capital of the Aztecs is modern-day Mexico City. Here we have it. Here is what it looks like modern day. The Incan citadel, castle, Machu Picchu, in the Andes Mountains in Peru. So these were all the civilizations that natives had built. And here we have a look at the tribes in North America. So this is all the land that natives had lived on for centuries, over generations, for thousands, for thousands of years. Sorry. He would later write in his book of prophecies that he felt that through colonization, he was fulfilling Bible prophecy for the end times, resulting in the genocide of the Taino. The Taino people encompassed this circle right here. Columbus wrote how the Taino welcomed the Spaniards with hospitality, kindness, and gifts. But in turn, They were enslaved, raped, and killed. Spaniards enslaved the Tiano to mine under the gold tribute system. Anyone who didn't meet the monthly quota would in turn have their hands chopped off. But because their children couldn't work, they were killed, thrown in rivers to drown, thrown to hungry dogs, or bashed against rocks. Columbus also gave children as rewards, as sex slaves for his men's loyalty and labor. Pregnant mothers, overworked and underfed, often gave birth to stillborns. Sometimes infants were born of rape and killed by the rapists. Sometimes mothers, out of deep despair, would commit infanticide. Columbus sent some Tiano as slaves to the royal court back in Spain. Queen Isabella was disturbed, as Columbus didn't have the authority to do so. She sent most back, but a few remained. Terrified communities of the Tiano committed suicide before capture, including by mass hangings, poison jumping off cliffs, and starving themselves to death. After he came back with gold, the Pope announced what's been dubbed the doctrine of discovery, enabling Spain to forcibly take land from non-Christians. He made a second and third voyage, bringing more Spaniards on more ships. Columbus sparked a race to colonize and get rich in the, quote, New World. So here we have first Spain, and then Portugal, and then France, and lastly, England. And that's what we're going to get into next. In 1500, in the next chapter, in 1500, Columbus wrote to a friend about the sex trade. Trading is common. There are a number of merchants who go in search of girls, 9 or 10. From 1492 to 1548, in 56 years, the Tiano went from approximately 250,000 down to approximately 500. During his third voyage, he hanged Spaniards for insubordination, as in defiance. So in 1500, he was stripped of his governorship and thrown in jail for 6 weeks. After, he was allowed his final fourth voyage. He died in 1506, bitter and still insisting he had reached Asia. From his arrival in 1492, throughout the century of European colonization that followed, a common estimate is that across the Americas, indigenous peoples declined from 60 million down to 6 million, largely due to exposure of new European diseases. So here we have an older estimate of where this was most. We have the Andes and Mexico and lowland. Basically, the altitude is lower. Where the altitude is lower, lowland, South America, and then Central America, and then North America is tied. So that's the population distribution. So about a collapse of 60 million people down to 6 million. And here we have a closer look at the types of diseases: smallpox, measles, typhus, cholera. Chapter 2, British America. After other failed attempts by the British to colonize North America, in 1607, quote, Jamestown became the first successful settlement, making Virginia Britain's first colony. And here's a rendition of how they built it in the early years. Excuse me. The crew of adventurers hoped to find gold, which would have funded valuable resupply missions from England. but found none and soon began to starve. By 1609, the settlers were routinely stealing food from the local Powhatan Indians, sparking a 5-year-long war between settlers and Indians. In the winter of 1609, Indians surrounded the fort, not allowing anyone to leave, thus starving the settlers. This winter is known as starving time. Desperate, people ate cats, dogs, horses, rats, dead humans, etc. During the starving time, the settlers declined from 500 down to 60. Later, in 1625, Jamestown President George Percy wrote to his brother that one man, quote, murdered his wife and salted her for his food. And that's how they wrote back then. But in 1612, the struggling settlers successfully grew tobacco. They exported it, sold it to England. They exported it, as in sold it, to England, finally affording them valuable resupply missions. In 1613, the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, was captured as a hostage during the war. In 1614, her marriage to John Rolfe marked the end of the war. Still, 2 more years followed. The 3 are collectively called the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. Anglo as in white or European. By 1612, slaves arrived. The Portuguese captured Africans in a series of African wars. They were forced to walk up to 200 miles to the coast, and at sea, English pirates stole a few dozen. The enslaved Africans were then sold to settlers. And 246 years of African enslavement followed, which we'll get into later, like in a way later chapter. We'll cover the entire history of it. Many in England were desperately poor and signed indentured servitude contracts, trading their labor, often 4 to 7 years, for passage, land, and money. Many were also forced, quote, troublesome, children, prisoners, Irish Catholics. Many died on the long voyage from England to British America. The women were often raped during their years of indentured servitude, and after their contracts ended, many were forced to marry their rapists. The men and children were left very poor after their contract expired. From 1620 to 1680, for 60 years, indentured servitude made up most of the South's labor force. Over the next 126 years, from 1607 to 1733, 13 British American colonies were established, many with different economies and complex relationships to Indians. And here we have a closer look at the 13 colonies. Largely from 1607 to 1900, for 293 years, through waves of immigration, wars with Indians over land, colony borders ever-changing, population booms, the South's slavery, then the North's industry, most wives lived under the coverture doctrine the entire time. The common belief that a husband, quote, covered his wife's legal identity meant that wives couldn't own property of any kind, a home, business, clothes, furniture, etc. This also meant that wives couldn't keep their own wages. The marital rape exception was the legal view that a wife couldn't prosecute her husband for rape because a wife's marriage vow constituted permanent consent. This also meant that domestic violence was not a prosecutable crime. Husbands were often violent drunks who beat their wives. Divorce was catastrophic. Because wives owned nothing, they'd lose everything. Loss of children, loss of income, loss of a home, social ruin, etc. Coverture was largely dismantled piece by piece throughout the 1800s. And that's British America. Chapter 3, the United States of America. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. A coalition group of countries led by Britain fought a coalition led by France over power. The war spanned continents and countries. It was pretty much the World War before World War I. And here is North America before and after. So this was French, and now France is out of there. So this is all Spanish, and then this is all British. Okay. Before, the colonies governed and taxed themselves, a result of Britain's solitary neglect. Britain avoided conflict in its many territories through loose oversight. But afterward, to help pay for the war, Britain taxed its British citizens, in its British American colonies. The colonists, being taxed without representation in government, were outraged. You know, the quote, no taxation without representation. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, 8 years. A desire for independence and a decade of tensions with Britain sparked a war. The American patriots fought largely with muskets, that is, rifles. The British regulars and also the loyalists, colonists loyal to Britain and King George III. A year into the war, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. Quote, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Here's the 13 British American colonies in 1775. We have this New England, which this area is still called New England today. That's the colonies in 1775. Rejected their status as British colonies in 1776. So when they rejected their status, this is the 13 original British colonies that fought to be free of Britain. And would later, following the war, all become U.S. states by 1790. And here we have a map of the United States in the year 1790. In the third year, France provided massive aid, whose supplies, troops, and naval power were invaluable to American victory. In the sixth year, after a decisive major battle with General George Washington, the British surrendered, but conflicts continued for 2 more years. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the U.S. as its own sovereign nation, that is independent, and it gave the U.S. the land of the 13 colonies from the Appalachian Mountains, plus from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. So here we have roughly where the Appalachian Mountains separated the 13 British colonies from the rest of British territory, and they were given this land also afterwards. During the war, 25,000 to 70,000 patriots died, mostly from disease. After an 8-year failed attempt at a new government, the Constitution successfully established 3 interdependent branches of government in a representative republic. The Constitution starts with "We the people." It established a representative republic, a government where elected officials make the laws. So legislative, executive, and judicial. So legislative, that's going to be Congress, who makes the laws. Executive, that's going to be the president. And judicial is going to be the courts, including the Supreme Court. So checks and balances. It established federalism, a system where the powers between the federal and state governments are divided. In 1791, the Constitution also gave citizens rights. The Bill of Rights added the first 10 amendments, additions or changes, to the Constitution. Amendments as in additions or changes. Instead of monarchs, the U.S. elected presidents. George Washington, and then John Adams, and then Thomas Jefferson as the first three. In 1790, the North began to industrialize with textile mills that spun cotton into yarn. A century of industrialization, manufacturing, etc. followed, which we'll get into way later. By 1804, all northern states had either abolished slavery or passed gradual abolition laws that freed slaves past a certain age. Northern abolitionists attempted to pass abolition laws in the South as well, but failed. The South continued to use slaves. The North continued to industrialize. Since the new land acquisition under the Treaty of 1783, so many had moved over the Appalachian Mountains and into the new frontier, that is the moving boundary between unsettled and settled lands. So when people were moving on here and they were slowly settling on the American frontier, that's what the American frontier is, it's the moving line, that Kentucky and Tennessee had formed by 1796. The following century would see one of the fastest continental migrations in human history. So much westward expansion that by 1890, the U.S. would be 44 U.S. states. Oh, there would be, okay, my grammar was correct. There would be 44 U.S. states. Chapter 4, Westward Expansion. From 1803 to 1853, over 50 years, the U.S. acquired land from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean by purchasing land from France, signing treaties with Britain and Spain, and fighting a war with Mexico, resulting in the erasure of indigenous peoples. So let's talk a little bit about, you had the Louisiana Purchase first, and then Adams-Onis, and then the annexation of Texas, and then the Oregon Treaty, and then Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then the Gadsden Purchase. And then Alaska and Hawaii eventually as well. But, I mean, this is a little outside of westward expansion, and nobody was actually settling into Alaska when it was purchased from Russia. So we're going to kind of ignore those. The Louisiana Purchase. The U.S. purchased approximately 828,000 square miles from France for $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. The Convention of 1818. So I guess I should point to what's happening on a map. The Convention of 1818, the U.S. decided much of the U.S.-Canada border, and they swapped lands. Britain got this, and the U.S. got this. Adams-Onis Treaty. Spain was unable to defend Florida against mounting U.S. pressure and ceded it to the U.S. along with other territories. So here's France. Also, not France, Spain. So the U.S. got this. It also got this. It got this, and it got some of this. Texas annexation. Ownership of Texas was disputed. So when the U.S. annexed it, it sparked the brutal Mexican-American War lasting nearly 2 years. Oregon Treaty, 1846. When pioneers flooded in and outnumbered the British, Britain decided to peacefully split Oregon along the 49th parallel, that is latitude, so this line. So they extended the border here, and they finished off the U.S.-Canada border. And then the British basically moved up here. They got that section of it. the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. After victory in the Mexican-American War, the U.S. purchased Mexico to sell much of its territory for $15 million, 4 cents an acre. Excuse me. It's because I'm a little bit nervous, that's why. Gadsden Purchase, 1853. The U.S. paid Mexico $10 million for an additional strip of land, 53 cents an acre. I only have this room for like until 4 p.m., so that's when the library closes. I got to get this done. All right. So in 50 years, the U.S. acquired land, as the song goes, quote, from sea to shining sea. So it had land from the Pacific to the Atlantic in essentially half a century. And then a century of westward expansion into it. 300,000 to 500,000 pioneers traveled 2,000 miles to Oregon from the 1840s to 1860. And here we have the Oregon Trail, and then it splits into the California Trail as well, which we're going to get into. 300,000 49ers joined the California Gold Rush from 1849 to 1855. So here's how people traveled. They traveled, I showed you this route. They also traveled here and then across here, and then they traveled all the way around. And people also traveled from all over the world. So gold was a very big deal, and the gold rush was a very big deal, and it established, when you have a lot of population in an area, it also helps establish statehood. So California also became a state. 1.6 million homesteaders claimed 10% of the U.S., over 160 million acres, for free through the Homestead Acts from 1862 to 1934, which largely functioned to populate the West. And here we have a look at how homesteaders looked. So the Continental Railroad drove expansion from 1869 to 1890. So after the Civil War, which we're going to get into later, this thing was completed. So it was completed in 2 chunks. So one company did this and another company did this. I think it was companies. I don't know who it was, but afterwards it was built. And this saw a lot of, this continued the expansion. This continued westward expansion. And then you have the Wild West here forming cowboys, outlaws, cattle ranching, that sort of thing. So that's after the Civil War. Manifest destiny was the widespread belief that it was destined to expand. The painting American Progress, 1872, depicted settlers led by the mascot Lady Columbia, bringing light into the darkness while displacing the savage Indians and their bison. So this used to be a mascot of the United States, the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. So Washington is named after George Washington. The District of Columbia is named after Lady Columbia. So here we see from light to darkness as settlers are coming in, and then Indians and their bison are being displaced. The underlying truth of westward expansion is that natives had a better claim to the land they lived on, and had for thousands of years, than Spain, France, England, Mexico, or the U.S. So when the U.S. made a land acquisition, it resulted in the erasure of natives. And that's the underlying truth of all the treaties and everything. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act resulted in the military forcibly moving Indians to designated Indian territory, resulting in the Trail of Tears. The military forced approximately 60,000 Indians to travel to Louisiana. Most walked hundreds of miles, and many walked over 1,000. Thousands died. So there was a designated unorganized territory. Indians were forced into here. So by boats here, but famously the tribes here. And the story behind this is really crazy. The Senate actually ruled that this was its own sovereign nation and that Georgia couldn't touch them. And then Andrew Jackson said, no, we're moving them. From 1778 to 1871, tribes were forced to sign approximately 368 treaties, relocating them to reservations. The U.S. gained 2 billion acres and in exchange made guarantees that reservation boundaries would be permanent, but routinely gave reservation land to homesteaders. Food and goods, but has weaponized starvation. For example, withholding rations until parents send their children to boarding school. Healthcare, but has underfunded it. Education, but forced children into boarding schools to erase their cultures and assimilate them into white culture. The tribes could fish at their former lands, but has routinely arrested natives for, quote, fishing off reservation. Every treaty, all approximately 368, has been broken. And a treaty is in the Constitution as the highest form of agreement. It's basically the same level of power that a constitution has. That's what a treaty is. Here we can see the lands here, largely throughout westward expansion. So this is what used to be Indian land here. And then we start westward expansion, Louisiana Purchase, Adams Onus, all of that, Trail of Tears, and then this is it. By the end, a little bit, I think into the 1930s a little bit. Settler colonialism continued. From 1819 to 1969, for 150 years, tens of thousands of children were forced into boarding schools for the erasure of their culture and assimilation of white culture. Here's an example of a boarding school. And here is what assimilation is. From 1872 to 1883, the Great Buffalo Slaughter saw buffalo hide hunters, aided by the Army, U.S. Army, killed tens of millions of bison, resulting in widespread starvation. So bison were a major part of the indigenous way of life. They were a main food source, used to make clothing, for example, coats, used to make shelter, teepee covers, used to make tools out of the bones. A part of culture and identity. From a peak of 30 million to 60 million, the bison population had collapsed to fewer than 1,000 by the 1890s. Here we have a picture of bison skulls. These are all just skulls of bison. There's a human for reference. This was the mid-1870s. From 1775 to 1890, at least 30,000 Indians were killed in wars. The battles of the Trans-Mississippi West, that is west of the Mississippi, from 1860 to 1890. So here's some of the battles that were fought as people were expanding and sometimes settling directly on reservation land that that the United States was giving to people, given their land. In 1890, the U.S. Census declared the frontier closed by their specific definition, marking the end of westward expansion. By the end, the U.S. had 44 states. So if you draw a line here, a vertical line, and you go through it, you'll always touch an acre of American land with at least 2 settlers on it. So that is what their specific definition is. But it was a huge news that the American frontier was closed because it was such a huge part of American life. Within westward expansion are the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution. Let's cover the different worlds of the South's slavery and the North's industry. And that was westward expansion. Chapter 5, the Civil War, as it relates to the complete history of the South's slavery. African enslavement in North America, 1619 to 1865, 246 years. From the early 16th century to the mid-19th century, European merchants transported slaves from Africa to the New World across 36,000 voyages. And here's the transatlantic triangular trade. So manufactured goods from Europe, as in, for example, textiles like clothes and spirits, which just means alcohol, to Africa. And then from there, slaves to, quote, the New World. And then they would get exports like, while they were there, sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and they would sell that to Europe. So this was this was extremely profitable, this little triangle. Approximately 12.5 million Africans transported on ships across the Middle Passage, that is the Atlantic. Overcrowded on the deck below, unbearable heat and air, often complete darkness, stench of urine and feces. Slaves were either chained or stacked. Mothers gave birth in putrid conditions. Sometimes slaves were forced to dance. Slaves were whipped for control. Contaminated food resulted in epidemics. Often women and children were raped. Approximately 2 million died on the voyage through the Middle Passage. So, in total, 12.5 million transported and 2 million died just on the passage. Mostly from diseases, also from starvation, suicide, being raped. Some psychologically shut down and died, and some died soon after arrival. They were thrown overboard, so sharks followed slave ships. In 1808, the Atlantic slave trade was banned in the U.S. over fears that too many Africans would corrupt America's pure Christian values and culture. America bought 400,000 to 500,000 slaves from the Atlantic slave trade and illegally smuggled in another 50 to 100,000 afterward. Although the Atlantic slave trade was banned, the slave population grew to approximately 4 million by 1860, largely through the coerced and forced reproduction of slaves. By 1700, hereditary chattel slavery surpassed contractual indentured servitude as the South's primary labor force. Slavery became more codified, that is, like more permanent in law, and grew more brutal, treated as property. Slaves could be bought and sold, and were often branded like cattle with a hot iron on their chests, shoulders, and backs. Forced labor, the most common, was field work, as in cotton, tobacco, sugar. Work was from sunrise to sunset, 16 to 18-hour days. Often, light work started at 4 or 5. By 13 or 14, it was a full workload. Excuse me. They worked year-round, including winter. They lived in slave quarters, cabins, had no beds, just cheap blankets, had brutal cabin winters. Often, 6 to 10 people were stuffed in a 12 by 12 or 16 by 16 foot cabin. They often received just 2 sets of clothes per year. Forced breeding. Masters mated slaves as one does chattel on a farm. Quote, studs were forced to breed with multiple slave women, then kept or sold their children. Masters also raped their slave women, then kept or sold their mixed children under the legal doctrine partus sequitur ventrum. And that existed all the way up until after the Civil War. Up until Civil War ended it. Violence was used for punishment and control. Slaves were whipped, beaten, and mutilated. Masters kept the majority born into slavery, but approximately 1 million were sold at auctions, where 1 in 2 spouses were separated from each other, and 1 in 4 children from their parents. Raping slaves was common and legal in every slaveholding state. For example, throughout his lifetime, Thomas Jefferson owned approximately 620 slaves. He inherited Sally Hemings when she was approximately 14. She had 6 children with him. In 1843, James Hammond's diary exposed to the public his rape of a mother and daughter slave. But in 1857, the public elected him senator. In 1855, Celia, 14, was raped over 5 years and bore 2 children to her enslaver. At 19, in self-defense, she killed him. She was hanged for it. The fancy trade was the specialized sex slavery of women and children. Slaves of a lighter complexion, often born of rape, were sold at a premium. More than sex slaves, they were seen as status symbols. So this is the fancy trade. They were exported from the upper south and imported to the deep south. Girls as young as 10. Most, quote, prized girls were 12 to 16. The antebellum period, pre-Civil War. This is 1815 to 1861. This is basically a period of tensions between the North and the South. Slaveholders versus abolitionists. Slaveholders used the Bible to defend slavery. Abolitionists used the Bible to condemn slavery. The South's, quote, King Cotton plantations versus the North's industrialism. Expanding slavery into the West versus not expanding slavery into the West. So those were the tensions. From approximately 1790 to approximately 1840, the Second Great Awakening was a religious revival that sparked a huge surge in church membership and led to denominational splits. So you can see that simply here. Sometime deep into the Second Great Awakening, you see just the numbers shoot up. Church membership shoot up. From what I'm seeing, Methodist and Baptist the most. Revival camps were multi-day outdoor events. So this is what a revival camp looked like. You can see people camping out here, and all day they're singing, preaching, worshiping, all that. By 1860, the U.S. had nearly 4 million slaves, and 99.99% of them were in the South. So this is pre-Civil War. We get up to pre-Civil War. So 1790, and then you see the numbers going up. So right before the Civil War, let's just look at this. So in total, there was 4 million African Americans or Africans in the United States. This is the amount of them that were slaves here. And this is the amount that were free in the North. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. In 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott v. Sanford ruled that black people had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This polarized the nation. After Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, 11 southern states seceded and declared themselves the Confederate States of America, sparking a civil war. So this is what it looked like when the South seceded, and all of this was, they declared themselves a sovereign nation with a president and everything. The Union versus the Confederacy fought. The Union, President Abraham Lincoln, General Ulysses S. Grant, 19 million free people, and 2.1 million served. The Confederacy, President Jefferson Davis, General George E. Lee, 5 million free people, and 1 million served. And then 4 million slaves. The Industrial Revolution had industrialized warfare. So the Revolutionary War was primarily just a musket. Now you have all sorts of rifles and knives. You have grenades. You have cannons. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared slaves in, quote, rebellious states free. It was hard to enforce, but it shifted the war's stated purpose from preserving the Union to the complete abolition of slavery. The Union won in 1865 when Robert E. Lee surrendered, and the Confederacy collapsed. After Robert E. Lee surrendered, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The war lasted longer than anybody expected, but took place across 5 theaters. So you have the Western Theater, the Eastern Theater, the Gulf, and then past the Mississippi, and then the Pacific I see a battle. So that's, I'll put it up on screen one more time longer. This is the counties that's all battles. Approximately 700,000 soldiers died, the most deaths in any American war. A third from combat and 2/3 from disease. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, 12 years. The U.S. rebuilt the South, bringing it back into the Union. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except for prison labor. The 14th Amendment, 1868, black people get citizenship/protection. The 15th Amendment, voting rights for black men, like protection under the law that they're seen as citizens. After the Civil War, sharecropping replaced slavery in the South, trapping, quote, freedmen, free blacks, to agricultural work on farms for employers who were former slave masters. So here's the system of sharecropping. And it basically trapped people having a debt that was always higher than the wages that they were making. The vast majority of freedmen, 3 million, became sharecroppers, and vagrancy laws criminalized, quote, idleness, unemployment, imprisoning those who didn't. In jail, the state would lease them out, and corporations could legally work them to death. Possibly up to 200,000 prisoners were released, and at least 30,000 died. Here's a group of children that were convict leased. Convict leasing was outlawed in 1928. Sharecropping largely disappeared by the 1950s. Vagrancy laws were ruled unconstitutional in 1972. From 1877 to 1968, Jim Crow laws segregated black people into separate schools, neighborhoods, hospitals, restaurants, hotels, theaters, pools, bathrooms, etc. Jim Crow refers to blackface wearing singers and performers of the 1830s. In 1896, the Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson ruled segregation was, quote, separate but equal. But in practice, segregation was only separate, not equal. All right, we've covered the South's slavery. Now let's cover the North's industry. Chapter 6, the Industrial Revolution, as it relates to the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. Like not globally, but with the focus on the U.S. The Industrial Revolution, factories, skilled trades, mining, railroads, construction, etc. in the U.S. happened in two waves from 1790 to 1861, and then an interlude for the Civil War, and from 1865 to 1914. England's Industrial Revolution had spread to northern states by 1790, with the cotton spinning mill in Rhode Island. The first wave resulted in new technologies, steamboats, Erie Canal, railroad expansion, and then telegraph, which is Morse code. That was a huge one. The second wave started in 1865. By the 1880s, industrial work had surpassed farming in the North. The second wave resulted in the Gilded Age, 1870s to 1890s. Long hours, often 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Low wages, often $1 to $2 per day, $35 to $70 in 2026. Child labor, from approximately 1890 to 1910, 1 in 5 children worked. Unsafe conditions, frequent on-site injuries and deaths. The first wave of industrialization also resulted in brutal working conditions, but the second wave is distinct in its rise of monopolies. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Co., Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central, Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel. J.P. Morgan's J.P. Morgan Co. was the primary consolidator. J.P. Morgan merged companies into monopolies. He'd take a fee and a seat on the board of directors. By 1912, he sat at the center of the money trust, 6 to 8 bankers, controlling 341 directorships in 112 corporations, totaling $22 billion in combined assets, over $700 billion in 2026, over 50% of 1912's GDP. Workers went on, quote, turnouts, that is strikes, during both waves. In 1835, 20,000 went on strike across different trades, demanding better pay and fewer hours. From 1881 to 1900, 6 million went on strike in 23,000 strikes. That is when you don't work and you have demands. The Progressive Era, 1890 to 1920. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act prohibited, quote, trusts, that is monopolies. But when the economy crashed in 1893, companies merged to survive. From 1895 to 1904, approximately 1,800 consolidated into approximately 160, the largest until that point in history. The public backlash accelerated reform movements. Unions, strikes, muckraking, that is exposés, etc., by, quote, progressives. That's what they called themselves. And the reform movements led to 2 decades of reforms. The 16th Amendment, 1913, established a progressive income tax. I gotta get my grammar right. The 16th Amendment established the progressive income tax. The government's primary source of revenue was tariffs from 1789 to 1913, but tariffs became corruptible, and progressives argued they were regressive, taxed the poor more. So the progressive income tax aimed at both wealth inequality and corruption. The 17th Amendment, 1913, established the election of senators. Corporations had been buying out senators to control tariffs. The 18th Amendment prohibited alcohol, and then the 21st Amendment repealed it. It took it away. So there's no longer the 19th Amendment. It's not in effect. Approximately 12 new federal acts and new institutions were established. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the U.S. Department of Labor, Federal Trade Commission, etc. From 1851 to 2017, corporations consolidated in 7 waves. Of the 7, the Great Merger Movement, which accelerated the progressive era, was the smallest. I think just under Nestle, there's thousands of companies, just under Nestle. Here's the massive wave of consolidations that resulted in the progressive era right here. And it's the smallest of what we've had since. All right. And there we have the Industrial Revolution. All right, so we've reached back to the end of westward expansion, and we're moving forward. Chapter 7, New Imperialism, as it relates to new imperialism in the U.S. When the American frontier was declared closed in 1890, expansion didn't end. While settler colonialism continued at home, the U.S. expanded into traditional empire building abroad. The annexation of Hawaii, 1898. In 1826, the U.S. recognized the Kingdom of Hawaii as a sovereign nation. Here's Queen Liliuokalani. Here's a luau party at the Royal Palace. Here's the Lolani Palace, the royal residence from the outside. And here's some children playing in the kingdom. In 1893, a group of businessmen facing the loss of influence over the islands overthrew the Hawaiian kingdom with the support of the U.S. Marines. These guys. And here's an example of a Hawaiian sugar plantation that they owned. President Grover Cleveland was outraged, but the Senate ruled that they were clear of any wrongdoing. After his presidency, he joined the American Anti-Imperialist League, a growing anti-imperialist, anti-expansionist movement. In 1898, Hawaii was annexed, that is added as a U.S. territory. In 1909, the Queen sued the U.S. and lost the Spanish-American War. In Cuba, they call this the Cuban War for Independence. This was the last 4 months, though, when of American involvement. Cuba was fighting for independence from Spain, and the U.S. military intervened, quickly ending the war. Cuba gained its independence, but at a cost. For example, the U.S. built a naval base in Cuba in 1903 known as Guantanamo Bay. The Treaty of Paris, 1898. So after that war, Spain gave up ownership of Cuba, so it gained its independence. It transferred ownership of Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. It sold the Philippines for $20 million. That is approximately $800 million in 2026. The U.S. now practiced the the same imperialism it fought a revolutionary war against. The American Anti-Imperialist League saw through the hypocrisy. Its 20 to 30,000 members included former President Grover Cleveland, famous writer Mark Twain, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and more. Andrew Carnegie offered to reimburse the U.S. $20 million in exchange for their independence. The offer fell through and he joined the League. So the Philippines went from Spain's imperialist control to America's. The Philippine-American War that resulted. The U.S. liberated Filipinos just to control them. Filipino frustration sparked war. Quote, "The Declaration of Independence applies only to people capable of self-government." Senator Albert Beveridge's congressional speech titled "In Support of an American Empire," 1900. Some civilians took up fighting. That's called guerrilla warfare. U.S. soldiers couldn't tell the difference, grew frustrated, and committed atrocities against civilians. Innocent civilians were raped, pillaged, tortured, and massacred by U.S. soldiers. So I want to give a little sense of the sentiment that soldiers had. So, for example, a soldier wrote home in 1899, "I'm in my glory when I sight some dark skin, pull the trigger." For example, a soldier wrote in a letter in 1900, "This is a very rich country, and we want it. My way of getting it, blow every N-word into N-word heaven." For example, Major Littleton Waller testified in 1902 that he was instructed to, quote, "kill and burn everything over 10. The U.S. Army turned towns into concentration camps where thousands of civilian men, women, and children died of disease and starvation. In 1902, the U.S. declared the war over, but fighting continued up to 1913. I'll just say, a part of the irony is that the public was outraged when they found out that the Spanish were killing Cubans in concentration camps. That's a part of why the U.S. got involved. In 1902, the U.S. declared the war over, but fighting continued up to 1913. Death count, approximately 4,300 U.S. soldiers, approximately 20,000 Filipino combatants, and approximately 200,000 civilians. Indirect count, disease and famine, totals 600,000 to 1 million. In 1946, the U.S. granted the Philippines independence. In 1914, after a brutal decade of development, the Panama Canal was built, revolutionizing trade. So, I'm just going to read off the infographic. 1881, the first ground broken by France. 1882, the French start active work. 1904, U.S. acquires the canal from France. U.S. begins work on the canal. 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt visits Panama, the first U.S. president to make an official visit. 1913, waters of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans finally meet, so it's finishing up. And then the first transit in 1914. And then there's been improvements since. So we have here the Pacific Ocean, and we have here the Atlantic Ocean. So you go through this journey, there's a lake, and then you make it across. And it saves you the time. So from New York to San Francisco, that's 5,200 miles if you use it, and if you don't use it, that's approximately 13,000. So massive. And then there's some more interesting facts. The biggest sanitation project in history took place there. Total fatalities during construction is approximately 25,600. Okay, and here's roughly how it works. Now, I tried to look into this. I tried to understand it. There's a reason why I'm into history and not and not an engineer. This is basically how it works right here. The water lifts up to the lake, and then it takes you down to the other side. Crazy. 1914, can you believe it? The start of World War II in 1914 marked the end of new imperialism globally. So other countries were also practicing new imperialism. World War I put a stop to it. U.S. territories in 1917. So right here we have a lot of islands here. Philippines, Alaska, which later became a state. The Virgin Islands right here. Puerto Rico, and then Guantanamo Bay. Okay. As of 2026, the U.S. has 14 territories, 5 of which are inhabited. People live in. 3.6 million live in unincorporated, not fully covered by the Constitution, U.S. territories. All right. That's new imperialism. Ended with the start of World War I. World War I, Chapter 8. As it relates to U.S. involvement abroad and activity on the home front. There were tensions between European coalitions over power and empire for a decade. The Triple Alliance, that is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And then we have the Triple Entente. We have right here, these three. Russia, France, and Britain. So it was tensions between these two that led to the conditions of World War I. In 1914, a member of the royal family of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated. Germany, an ally of Austria-Hungary, sparked a war. The two coalitions fought out of fear and a desire for power and empire. The media began calling them the Allied powers versus the Central powers. The Allied powers, primarily Britain, France, and Russia. The Central powers, primarily Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Zimmermann Telegraph, this was towards the end of World War I. The Zimmermann Telegraph was a German telegram proposing an alliance with Mexico against the U.S. It was intercepted, and so in 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany. 2 months later, the U.S. sent troops to join the Allied powers on Germany's Western Front, and Russia continued to fight on its Eastern Front, squeezing the German Empire from both sides. So you have the Eastern Front being squeezed, the Western Front being squeezed, and you have the Eastern Front being squeezed. All right. For example, on the Western Front in 1918, Germany's spring offensive made significant territorial gains in France, but was successfully countered by the Allied forces' 100 Days offensive, which recovered lost territory. For example, Russia lost a majority of battles and withdrew from the Eastern Front in 1918. Still, their alliance, the Russian Empire collapsed. That's why they pulled out. Still, their alliance with the Allied powers held back the Central powers from expanding east, while decisive victories came from the West. President Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign slogan was, quote, "He kept us out of war." For the first few years of World War I, the U.S. stayed out of it, and citizens were happy about that. But after declaring war, he established the Creel Committee, a pro-war propaganda agency. Only 73,000 had initially volunteered, so a draft enlisted 2.8 million, and the consent of another 1.9 million volunteers was largely manufactured with a propaganda campaign. So very few initially volunteered, and so there was this huge draft and a huge propaganda campaign. The Creel Committee distributed 20 million plus posters and 75 million plus pamphlets. And here's an example, one that I think people would recognize. They produced 3 pro-war films and many additional reels. They had a network of 75,000, quote, 4-minute men, that is trained speakers, who gave 4-minute pro-war speeches in public spaces all across America. In 1917, the Espionage Act, was used to prosecute anti-war speakers. The popular socialist Eugene Debs gave an anti-war speech in 1918 and was sentenced to 10 years for it. He served nearly 3 years before his release. The act is still used on anti-government speakers. In 2013, Edward Snowden was prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917 for whistleblowing on the U.S. government. The NSA, he exposed that the NSA was spying on everybody. In 1918, facing collapse, Germany signed an armistice, an agreement to stop fighting, effectively surrendering. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Notably, the League of Nations was established to promote and maintain peace. Although it would fail, it led to the creation of the United Nations. Notably, the Reparations Commission set Germany to pay the equivalent of 570 billion 2026 USD in reparation to France and Britain mostly. It took Germany until 2010 to pay off its World War I debt. The $10 billion the U.S. loaned the Allies during World War I and the 1.39 million soldiers who served on the Western Front were arguably necessary for victory. And here we have approximately 16.5 million deaths, 9.7 military, and 6.8 million civilians, left much of Europe in rubble. So this is military, and then this is civilians. So Germany, Turkey, and Russia. Top three in Turkey is mostly civilians, and then here's U.S. involvement here. 117,000 deaths. Okay. So it was largely a European war, but arguably U.S. involvement was necessary for victory. Resulted in the collapse of 4 empires: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Here's a map of Europe pre-World War I. In 1914, you'll see that the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire take up a huge portion of land. And then after a civil war in Russia, the Soviet Union, and then Poland got its land back, the German Empire collapsed and Austria-Hungary collapsed. So this is Austria-Hungary here. That's 1930. Post-World War I, the founding father of fascism, Italy's Benito Mussolini seized power and aimed to restore the Italian Empire to its former glory as the Roman Empire. A year later, a World War I veteran, Adolf Hitler, tried his own coup. He failed, was imprisoned, and wrote about his hatred towards Jews in Mein Kampf, My Struggle. His cruelty towards, quote, enemies of the state would soon encompass Europe. He would, in 2 decades, spark war. And that was World War I. Chapter 9, the Great Depression, which exists between World War I and World War II. And it was worldwide, but this is just as it relates to the United States. The Great Depression, 1929 to 1941. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the start. The following deflationary spiral, vicious cycle of falling prices, deepened the recession into a depression. 9,000 banks failed. $1.3 billion in people's bank accounts were lost. Over 85,000 businesses closed. GDP fell by approximately 30%, the worst economic downturn in U.S. history. The unemployment rate reached 25%. By 1932, millions were either squatting in vacant buildings, living in Hoovervilles, doubling with relatives, riding trains in search of work, or relying on soup kitchens for meals. And up to 40% of Americans faced no significant hardship. Hoovervilles were shanty towns named at a jab at President Herbert Hoover. And here we have the outside of a shanty town, these makeshift houses out of anything. And here we have the inside of one. The 1930s saw the highest suicide rate in U.S. history, 17.4 to 22.1 suicides per 100,000 people, with 1932 being the highest year. This was largely due to loss of life savings in an instant. Foreclosures meant a loss of homes, farms, businesses. Loss of breadwinner identity came with a sense of shame and guilt. The Bonus Army of 1932 included 43,000 veterans, families, and protesters from all over America who traveled to the White House to demand early World War I bonus payments. They were denied. Afterward, D.C. police shot and killed 2 veterans. Then President Herbert Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to clear them out. The U.S. Army set fire to camps and threw tear gas, a chemical weapon, as thousands ran. A child was partially blinded. A 3-month-old baby died. Approximately 1,000 veterans were injured. And here we have some photos here. Photos are going to do a better job explaining the atmosphere and the solidarity and poverty that was had during this march. And here's camps being set on fire. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a series of economic reform programs in 2 waves called the New Deal. So this is after Herbert Hoover. We have FDR coming in to make some changes. Called the New Deal, many are still active. For example, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. Since 2008, it has insured bank funds of up to $850,000. For example, the Social Security Act, retirement benefits for people that are 65 plus, unemployment insurance, and disability benefits since 1956. For example, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Since 2009, it has kept the minimum wage at $7.25. So that's what that is, the Fair Labor Standards Act. But these were huge changes during the time. In 1941, World War II mobilization preparation began to drastically reduce unemployment. By 1943, mass unemployment was gone, down to 1.9%. The jobs were war production at home or the military abroad. So as I understand this map, so you have the Great Depression here, peaks at 25% unemployment. Then you have the first wave of the New Deal, and then you have a recession, and then you have the second wave of reforms, and then World War II mobilization drastically brings this down. All right, let's talk about World War II. Chapter 10, World War II. The European theater, where it started, and the Pacific theater, where it ended. That's going to be my focus. The Nazi German Empire, 1933 to 1945. In 1933, in Germany, under intimidation, the Enabling Act was voted in, enabling Adolf Hitler to make laws without parliament, making him, quote, Führer. Hitler was largely driven by anti-Semitism and ideas of racial supremacy, and aimed to expand Germany's Lebensraum, living space. He illegitimately annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, enabled by British and French empires' appeasement, who wanted to avoid a war. Poland had a defensive alliance with Britain and France, so when Hitler invaded it, France and Britain declared war, marking 1939 as the start of World War II. Poland had the most Jews in Europe, who at first were forced to live in ghettos. Later, concentration camps for detention and forced labor were built, of which some evolved into mass murder centers. For example, by 1942, Auschwitz, the biggest complex of camps, was mass gassing Jews. In total, 1.1 million were murdered there. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, which brought the U.S. into the war, thus joining the Allied powers against the Axis powers. And the Allied powers, the main ones, were USA, UK, USSR, and then the main Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. In 1942, at the peak of Hitler's and Nazi Germany's control, the U.S. started sending troops to Germany's western front of the European theater. So here we have the peak of Nazi Germany, how much territory they encompassed. So the Western Front is going to be this. Oh, and there was also significant battles in North Africa. But this is the Western Front. This is the Eastern Front. So again, squeezing Germany. Allies on Germany's Western Front started winning pivotal battles, slowly squeezing Germany from the West. For example, D-Day was a catastrophic loss for Germany on the Western Front. So you have Allies invade Normandy and then claim territory of France back. And then you have D-Day by the numbers. You have 156,000 troops, Allied troops, the total. And you have ships, 6,000, you have almost 7,000 ships and 11,500 aircraft, 11,500 aircraft to win this battle. The USSR on Germany's Eastern Front started winning pivotal battles, slowly squeezing Germany from the east. For example, the Battle of Stalingrad was a catastrophic loss for Germany on the Eastern Front. So Germany decided, so the USSR had neutrality, and Germany decided, let's take USSR land, broke that neutrality, and then you have the biggest battle in world history here, Stalingrad. This city and around this city, let's look at some stats. The Battle of Stalingrad. Soldiers in battle, over 2 million, and these are estimates. Average lifespan of a soldier in this battle. This one battle spanned for 200 days. The average lifespan of a soldier, 24 hours. The winter temperatures got really cold, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Axis powers casualties, this is Germany and whatnot, 800,000. Red Army casualties, 1.1 million. A total of 1.9 million people died in a single World War II battle. And Stalingrad is named after their Russian leader. And civilian deaths, 40,000. But it was a massive loss for Germany. And so from the Western Front, Germany was getting squeezed, and from the Eastern Front, Germany was getting squeezed. By 1945, the Allies on the Western Front and the USSR on the Eastern Front had reached deep into Germany, closing in on the Axis powers. Italy's Mussolini was shot and hanged by Italian partisans. Next, Hitler committed suicide, and soon Germany surrendered. But by then, Nazis' cruelty had murdered approximately 12 million. Approximately 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Quote, burnt offering. When the USSR's Red Army liberated Auschwitz, they found approximately 1 million pieces of clothing, approximately 45,000 pairs of shoes, and approximately 7.7 tons of human hair from female prisoners. Here's Jewish children in the liberated Auschwitz camp. Here is the sunglasses that the USSR found at Auschwitz. American troops liberated approximately 30,000 at Dachau. Wedding rings after the U.S. liberated Buchenwald. Soviets, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, often prisoners of war. Approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war in the Mauthausen concentration camp. Non-Jewish Polish people, approximately 1.8 million, and millions of other, quote, subhumans. Imperial Japan, let's talk about the Pacific Theater. Imperial Japan, 1868 to 1947. So when Imperial Japan started, they quickly industrialized, and then they wanted in on the empire game. They wanted in. Here is how much land they possessed incredibly fast. That's the peak of the Japanese Empire in 1942. Emperor Hirohito ruled Imperial Japan. What Hitler's Nazi Germany was to the European theater, Hirohito's Imperial Japan was to the Pacific theater. For example, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Aerial bombings, mass killings, famine, disease, forced labor, and widespread displacement resulted in 14 to 20 million deaths of mostly civilians. So that's potentially more deaths than the entirety of World War I across China. So Manchuria. In Manchuria, you had what's called Unit 731, which we'll get into. You see this became Japanese control, and Korea, which we'll also talk about a little bit, and Nanjing, China, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. For example, the rape of Nanjing, 6 weeks of sadism in 1937. The rape and massacre of 200,000 to 300,000 people in Nanjing, China. Survivors like Jia Shuquan and Zhao Jinhao, and missionaries present like Minnie Voltron described women being raped and killed in front of their families, pregnant mothers being gutted, infants thrown in the air and caught on swords, etc. Reverend James McCollum's journal described over 20 men raping a girl about 9 years old, then killing her with a bamboo stick. Even a Nazi stationed there, John Rabe, wrote directly to Adolf Hitler begging Germany to intervene. Zhao Jinhao, a survivor, described being 13 during the massacre and witnessing the sister of her grandma being raped and drowned in a river. And here's her story. For example, Unit 731, Asian Auschwitz, in northeast China. A military facility for chemical and biological weapons research and the human experimentation of, quote, Maruta, special imports of Chinese civilians. And here's a look at this hellhole. Here's the complex. The scientists' experiments included raping female prisoners and later performing experiments on the newborns, flamethrowers and grenade tests on prisoners, freezing arms and shattering them, giving prisoners deadly diseases, then performing live vivisections, dissections, to study them, pressure chamber tests to study how long until organs burst, for example, eyes, tying prisoners to crosses, then exploding biological weapons, etc. Not a single prisoner survived. 3,000 to 14,000 died in Unit 731's tests. Not a single prisoner survived. Their epidemic tests of dropping ceramic bombs of disease-infected fleas on Chinese cities killed 300,000 plus civilians. Operation PX was Japan's plan to work with the commanding officer of Unit 731, Shiraishi, and begin horrifying biological warfare against the U.S. The plan never went through. For example, comfort women, sex slaves across Asian Pacific countries. So this was largely, think Korea. A common estimate of approximately 200,000 women and girls, largely of Korean and Chinese descent, were forced into sex slavery for the Japanese military. In 2001, a Japanese professor, Nakahara Michiko, published a paper where she had interviewed the daughter of a comfort woman. Her daughter told me her mother has nightmares and cries in her sleep. She used to wander aimlessly after the bad dreams. She told me herself that she begged God to pardon her for the sins she had committed. She still suffers from her memory and her feeling of having sinned. It seems nobody in her village ever told her that it was not her sin at all. Former comfort woman demanding an apology from the Japanese embassy in 2001. One of the last survivors from South Korea, Yun Soo Lee, next to a picture of comfort woman. As of 2026, she's 97 and an activist. In 1942, the U.S. decided to develop the world's first nuclear weapons. By 1945, it had successfully developed 2 of them. The Manhattan Project cost nearly $1.9 billion. Here's a little boy A-bomb. Here's Boxcar, which dropped little boy on Hiroshima. This plane. Here's the Fat Man A-bomb. Here's the Enola Gay, which dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. In 1945, the U.S. nuked Japan. So across the Pacific Ocean, they might have stopped at Pearl Harbor, nobody knows. Then they made it to these islands here, and then August 6th, you see Hiroshima was nuked first, and then you see the path here to nuke Nagasaki. Here's the mushroom clouds from the A-bombs taken by the pilots who dropped them. Approximately 118,000 civilians died on the days of, totaling approximately 210,000 by the end of 1945. Here's an example of a carbonized boy. Like this, and it's over. Here's Tayoka Karogata, a survivor getting treated at a hospital. Here she is decades later. As of 2026, there are approximately 100,000 Hibakusha survivors left. Japan surrendered a month later, marking 1945 as the end of World War II. While the U.S. did aid in ending the cruelty of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, it was guilty of its own cruelty. It firebombed Tokyo, which killed approximately 100,000 civilians, nuked 2 cities, which killed approximately 200,000 civilians, and held innocent people in internment camps. The most damning details were censored from America's predominantly Christian population. Hiroshima held 12 American prisoners of war, and Nagasaki was Japan's most Christian city. Christians had survived in Nagasaki for centuries. The nuke was dropped less than a mile away from the largest cathedral in all of East Asia. Here's the Urakami Cathedral before the bombing. This is in Nagasaki, the Fat Man bomb, atomic bomb. Here is the Urakami Cathedral after bombing. And here's the Urakami Cathedral after reconstruction. This is a modern photo. From 1942 to 1946, the U.S. forcibly moved approximately 120,000 innocent Japanese Americans from their homes and into internment camps. And here we have a location. So there could be absolutely no Japanese people in here. And then this is across the U.S., the different kinds of camps that they had for this. Here's a camp in Santa Barbara, California. Here's what one camp looked like from the inside. Here's the same camp from the outside. 2/3 were U.S. citizens born in the U.S. They suffered billions of dollars in property and income losses. After the war, most just got $25 and a train ticket. Years later, in 1988, the U.S. admitted it was based on, quote, racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a lack of political leadership, reimbursing over $1.6 billion to over 80,000 survivors and their heirs, $20,000 each, making the wrong a little more right. The question of whether the nukes were necessary to end the war swiftly has been fiercely debated, remains unanswered, and is possibly unknowable. All documents have been pored over, and all key figures of Imperial Japan are dead. However, the American-Japanese relationship has greatly improved. After World War II, Hirohito renounced his divinity, reducing the emperor to a ceremonial role. Then the U.S. drafted a constitution ushering democracy and better relations. From 1945 to 1952, the U.S. spent $2.2 billion on rebuilding Japan. World War II, 60 to 85 million deaths. Common estimate is 15 plus million military and 45 million plus civilians, the deadliest war in U.S. history, in world history. You have the United States here at the bottom, 418,000 military deaths. Soviet Union, this is their military deaths, and then their civilian deaths. They suffered. They lost the most. And then China, this is largely from Imperial Japan. And then Germany, of course, and then Poland, of course, civilians. Yeah, one thing of note, it's pretty wild to think that after World War II, the Soviet Union lost so many people, and it was still the dominant power alongside the U.S. Wild. 1/3 of all World War II deaths were the result of famine and famine-related diseases. So this is what happens in wartime. People cannot get food. This is World War II. And this right here, the great leap forward in China, we're going to talk about that during the Cold War. So we'll get into that. The Allied powers forced Germany to pay reparations. As of 2018, the debt has been paid off. $86.8 billion from 1945 to 2018. World War II resulted in the collapse of 3 empires: Imperial Japan, Nazi German Empire, Italian colonial empire, and was a catalyst for the end of others. British Empire, French colonial empire, Dutch colonial empire, Belgian colonial empire, Portuguese colonial empire. The collapse of empires resulted in the decolonization of Africa. In 1939, 99% of Africa was colonized. So this was divided up largely by European powers. After waves of decolonization, Africa now consists of 44 independent nations. And we're going to take a look at a modern map of Africa for a second. After World War II in 1945, 51 nations made up the United Nations. As of 2026, 193 countries participate. Resolutions, things they vote on, act as a consensus but are non-binding. The United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine, 1947, was the proposal to create a two-state solution for both the Jews and the Palestinians' ancestral homes. As a result, the state of Israel was born. So here was the proposed plan. Arab Palestinians get this right here, and Israel gets this. So it's both a historic home of Jews and of Palestinians. Between 1947 and 1949, Zionist military forces destroyed at least 530 villages. So you have the Mediterranean Sea here, but a lot of them were displaced out of here, or into here, what is now known as the West Bank and Gaza's in there. The West Bank and Gaza. So around 15,000 were killed and more than 750,000 were forcibly displaced. And immediately after, the 5 surrounding nations went to war with Israel. So that's immediately after World War II. And here we have a map of how Israel looks today. You have the West Bank and then you have Gaza. And here's Israel. And yeah, ever since there's been conflict or armed conflict or wars all the way up until the present. Okay. Chapter 11, the Cold War. Okay, so that was World War II. Immediately after World War II, we get into the Cold War. The Cold War, 1947 to 1991. The Russian Empire collapsed during World War I, resulting in a civil war. After the Russian Civil War, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was formed. The USSR aimed to reach communism, that is, a stateless, classless, and moneyless society inspired by 1848's Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Post-World War II, the USSR became a global superpower, and communism spread. In 1947, tensions with the USSR led to President Harry Truman's Truman Doctrine. It aimed to contain the spread of communism, pledged to back democratic nations, and marked the start of an indirect war that would result in the death of millions. The US and USSR backed opposing sides in wars, proxy wars, Korean War, Vietnam War, Afghan War, etc. So this is a great representation of what a proxy war is. A game of chess. That these guys are not directly fighting, but everybody here is. Various other conflicts also characterize the Cold War. Coups secretly helping overthrow a government and replacing it, covert operations, spies, sabotage, election meddling, etc., arms races, nuclear weapons, missiles, submarines, etc., and the anti-war idea of mad, mutually assured destruction. We'll talk about this later. So, the stated goal of the USSR was to reach communism through socialism. The USSR framed itself as the, quote, People's Republic. The stated goal of the US was to contain communism, which it framed as a threat to freedom, democracy, and capitalism. The US framed itself as the, quote, free world. Cold War European military alliances. We have the Warsaw Pact and NATO. So the idea of democracy versus communism, it split Europe in half. Here's the Iron Curtain that divided the democratic and communist European countries. You can see Germany is divided there, and then the capital of Germany, Berlin, around West Berlin there was a wall that was a democratic part of it, and there was a wall around it. So including that and that wall and this physical and metaphorical wall that made up the Iron Curtain. And physical, it wasn't like some giant wall, but it was, armed guards, fencing. It was very difficult, and it was completely two different ideologies. Democratic, NATO, Warsaw Pact, communist. Joseph Stalin, 1878 to 1953, dead at 74 years old. He accumulated power over 7 years before becoming dictator at 51. His policies caused 10 to 20 million deaths, famine, executions, gulag, that is forced labor, etc. For example, Holodomor. Pre-World War II, 1932 to 33, his policies purposefully starved millions of Ukrainians to death. Stalin inspired the Chinese dictator Mao Zedong inspired the Chinese dictator Mao. From 1959 to 61, as a result of his policies, the Great Chinese Famine purposefully killed 15 to 55 million peasants. Here is the Great Chinese Famine, the biggest famine by far in world history. Done purposefully to kill off the poor trying to achieve this state of communism. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. From 1949 to 67, the U.S. amassed 31,000 nuclear warheads, the USSR 8.3 thousand. But the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, prevented their use. In 1962, Communist President Fidel Castro agreed to host Soviet missiles in Cuba in case America attacked. The same year, the U.S. discovered them. A tense 13-day standoff took place that threatened nuclear war. A Russian sub near Cuba had lost communication. Having reason to believe that war had started, they voted on whether to launch a nuclear torpedo. Just one on board, Vasily Arkhipov, refused the launch, which likely prevented nuclear war. The next day, the US and the USSR reached an agreement, avoiding World War III. From 1959, but especially after the frightful Cuban Missile Crisis, to 1991, a large number of treaties were signed that aimed to dismantle and prevent nuclear use. Tens of thousands have been dismantled, but as of 2026, approximately 12,000 remain. And you can see that 88% of it is just going to be between the US and Russia. The Russia has 4,400, and the US has 3,700. "12,000 nuclear warheads are theoretically enough to kill billions and end civilization with nuclear winter, worldwide famine, radiation cancer, etc. The space race against the USSR led to NASA's establishment in 1958. Later, in 1969, the Apollo 11 mission resulted in Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. I believe this is Buzz Aldrin and Neil is holding the camera. Here's another photo. I think this is also Buzz Aldrin saluting the flag here. Years prior, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy championed the moon landing to Congress. I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon. He was assassinated 2 years later in 1963. So he never got to see it, but humans did walk on the moon before the decade was out, as he dreamed. The first widely televised war, the Vietnam War. 1954 to 75, major U.S. combat from 1964 to 72. Here's French Indochina. This is during colonial rule that fell apart sometime after World War II. So this was all under colonial rule. Tonkin. I do not know if Tonkin was involved in the Vietnam War or not, but here's Laos, here's what became Cambodia, and here's Vietnam. So this was right before the collapse. And then after the collapse, afterward, Vietnam split, sparking a war. The North's communists versus the South's anti-communists. The U.S. backed South Vietnam. The USSR and China backed North Vietnam. So here you have it. And you can see the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You can see that the combat expanded into Laos and Cambodia as a result from this. So here's South Vietnam. Here's the border between, and here's North Vietnam. Communists, anti-communists. By 1790, the war expanded into Laos and Cambodia. Approximately 8 million tons of bombs were dropped throughout, resulting in approximately 26 million craters, and making Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos the most bombed countries in the world. Approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides dropped to deforest South Vietnam, targeting Viet Cong, that is, rebels in the south fighting for North Vietnam. Civilians reported birth defects in their babies. Later, veterans reported birth defects in their babies too. There were search and destroy operations in South Vietnamese villages to find rebels, resulting in civilians being tortured, raped, and shot by the hundreds. The primary example is going to be the My Lai massacre in 1968. There were reporters taking photos. Approximately 388,000 tons of napalm, sticky goo on fire, were dropped in South Vietnam. A photo of a child's clothes and skin burned after a napalm drop. Napalm Girl 40 years later. In 1975, Communist North Vietnam won. 58,000 U.S. military deaths, 304,000 wounded. 2.6 million U.S. soldiers fought, quote, in country. A common estimate is approximately 1.3 million North and South Vietnamese military deaths. A common estimate is approximately 2 million civilian deaths. In 1976, Vietnam reunited. The Communist Party has continued to rule since. In 1974, 19 months into his second term, President Richard Nixon resigned over Watergate. His campaign re-election group was caught bugging the offices at Washington, D.C.'s Watergate complex. enabled by connections in the CIA and FBI. The FBI was created in 1908, largely to handle domestic law enforcement. The CIA was created in 1947, largely to handle foreign intelligence. After Watergate, investigations into government agencies followed. What they found includes MKUltra's mind control and drugging experiments on humans by the CIA. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered MKUltra records to be destroyed to avoid public outrage, so the extent of human experimentation is unknown. Domestic intrusions, mail openings, bugs, break-ins, etc. by the CIA and FBI. Approximately 250,000 letters were illegally opened by the CIA and over 130,000 by the FBI. They found hundreds of illegal break-ins by the FBI. Anti-communist and pro-capitalist propaganda by the CIA and FBI. Over 400 journalists on payroll in major news outlets and press agencies. Over 1,000 books sponsored by the CIA. Propaganda over radio, television, magazines, etc. The FBI's counterintelligence program forged letters to breed violence to socialist groups, civil rights leaders, anti-Vietnam War groups, etc. Assassination plots of foreign leaders by the CIA. Cuba's Fidel Castro, Congo's Patrice Lumumba, Chile's Rene Schneider, etc. Since 1976, this is following the investigation, there has been congressional oversight of the CIA and FBI. In 1991, the USSR collapsed, leaving capitalism as the dominant economic system. Millions died in proxy wars, mostly civilians, plus approximately 100,000 U.S. military deaths. Towards the end of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain fell. European countries broke free from Soviet control, and Germany reunified. The Berlin Wall was torn down. Many later joined NATO and the EU, a more unified bloc of European countries. So that was the Cold War. Let's get into the next chapter, the Civil Rights Movement. Checking my battery. Okay, we're good. We're good. What's the time? Okay, I still have half an hour. Let's do this. Chapter 12, Civil Rights Movement. The post-World War II economic boom, 1945 to 1973. A boom created by the U.S. not being destroyed like others. USD being made the, quote, backbone of international trade. For example, oil is priced in USD globally. The GI Bill, etc. The GI Bill of 1944 aimed to uplift veterans by offering financial aid for education, low-interest home loans, etc. The boom created a mass middle class, largely from 16.1 million returning veterans. The new middle class shared productivity gains, along with the 1%, until 1973. So from World War II up until 1973, you see when corporations made more money and produced more goods, the wages also went up. And then this happened right here, where the productivity continued to go up, but the hourly compensation has barely moved. And here's the reasons for that, for why it was the same for a long time. A top marginal tax bracket of 91 to 94% from 1944 to 1963 helped fight inequality. That is, income past a certain level of wealth, that's taxed 91 to 94%. Everything under that is taxed less. So, but just the top marginal tax bracket, 91 to 94%. Quote, our revenue laws have operated in many ways to the unfair advantage of the law, and they have done little to prevent an unjust concentration of wealth and economic power. This was Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1945. Wages doubled between 1945 and 1973, largely aided by union membership. In 1954, union membership reached a historic 35% of all workers in non-farm employment. Home ownership grew from 14.6% in 1940 to 16.9% in 1960. Many veterans passed these homes to their children. There were over 1 million black veterans as well, but they were denied the same benefits. Maps that outlined neighborhoods in red, largely based on race, were used primarily from 1938 to 1968 to prevent residents of those neighborhoods from obtaining mortgage loans. Redlining prevented black renters from owning their homes. Racial covenants, used primarily from 1926 to 1948, were legal clauses in deeds that prevented homes in that prevented blacks from moving into white neighborhoods. Oh, that prevented. Oh. Ay, I shouldn't have touched that. I should not have touched that. All right, whatever. We're going to move on. Okay. That prevented homes in white neighborhoods from being sold to, quote, non-Caucasians. The GI Bill raised whites out of poverty, and Jim Crow segregation kept blacks in it. So here's the racial income gap as of 2016 data. So this demonstrates this perfectly. If you're a white family with no bachelor's degree, you're making more than both black people and Hispanic people with a bachelor's degree. And here's the comparison. If you're a black family without a bachelor's degree, you're making on average $11.6 thousand a year, and then here's the white family with no bachelor's degree, $98,000. Here's the white family with a bachelor's degree. Okay, and here's the black family with a bachelor's degree. This versus this. That's the gap. From 1954 to 1968, the Civil Rights Movement dismantled Jim Crow segregation laws. In 1954, the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education ruled public school segregation unconstitutional. It was a highly celebrated win, but in practice, like many of the Supreme Court's early civil rights rulings and acts, it went largely unenforced. A decade later, only 1% of black children attended schools with white children in the South. In 1955, in Alabama, Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus and was arrested, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. The peaceful protest lasted 381 days and was met with violence. Approximately 100 leaders were arrested. 4 black churches were bombed. Martin Luther King, who was voted leader of the boycott, had his porch bombed. In 1956, the Supreme Court's Browder v. Gale ruled bus segregation was unconstitutional, but it went largely unenforced in the South. In 1961, on a 39-day trip, black and white freedom riders traveled deep into the segregated South as a protest. The deeper they got, the more violence they faced. And here's that trip. From here, deep into the South. an example of violence by the Ku Klux Klan. So here's one of the buses that was burned. Inspired by the Freedom Riders, a coalition of civil rights groups formed. The Council of Federal Organizations, COFO, to coordinate civil rights campaigns and protests. For example, Freedom Summer 1964, whose peaceful protests against voter suppression were met with violence from Mississippi residents, the KKK, and cops. 1,062 arrests, 80 beatings, 37 churches were bombed or burned. 30 homes or businesses were bombed or burned. At least 7 deaths. President John F. Kennedy fought for what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most influential act of the movement. But in 1963, he was assassinated. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, passed the act for him, which further dismantled segregation. Quote, "First, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought for so long." President LBJ to Congress, 1963. In 1965, protesters marched 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery in 5 days to protest the violence, intimidation, and discrimination against black voters that were still ongoing. So here is this march. The first march ended when what were mostly state troopers attacked approximately 600 unarmed protesters with baton and tear gas. So this was the end of the very first march. Quote, "Bloody Sunday shocked the nation, and soon after, President LBJ passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which reinforced anti-voter suppression measures." Martin Luther King Jr., 1929 to 1968. Over 250,000 attended the March on Washington in 1963. Many leaders spoke, including Martin Luther King Jr., who gave his famous quote, "I have a dream" speech. Here's a photo of that event. You have crowds that are going all the way back. The FBI wiretapped and bugged King for years, trying to prove he was a communist. Instead, they found he was having affairs. In 1964, they sent him blackmail, trying to get him to commit suicide, threatening to release the tapes otherwise. The FBI offered the tapes to news organizations, but news outlets at the time had a, quote, "gentleman's agreement" not to talk about affairs. For example, John F. Kennedy's affairs were never discussed. King realized the bluff. In 1968, he opposed the Vietnam War. Quote, "We are spending all this money for death and destruction and not nearly enough money for life and construction." That year, he was assassinated by James Earl Ray, sparking nationwide riots. His assassination led to the Civil Rights Act of 1968, marking the end of the movement. Notably, the Fair Housing Act clause in the Civil Rights Act of 1968 outlawed redlining. The movement saw campaigns primarily in the South, especially in Alabama. It consisted of many leaders and activists. For example, Malcolm X, who was assassinated in 1965. It consisted of many peaceful protests, which were often met with violence. For example, high school students getting fire hosed in Birmingham in 1963. After the King assassination riots, Nixon ran his presidential campaign on bringing, quote, "law and order." The South overwhelmingly voted for Nixon, and he won. President Richard Nixon 1969 to 74, started the war on drugs, largely targeting black people. Quote, getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana, blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both, we could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying? Of course we did. Nixon's domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman in a 1994 interview. The war on drugs is ongoing as of 2026. Drug arrests are the number one arrest. Marijuana is the number one drug arrest. For example, from 2001 to 2010, there were 8.2 million marijuana arrests, of which 1.5 million resulted in jail time. Other notable drug arrests are going to be meth, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. Since 2002, the U.S. has the most incarcerated. And here's a map. So after the war on drugs, you see mass incarceration. Most held in prison are violent offenders, but most who leave are non-violent offenders. Here we have a breakdown of who's in prison. This was data from 1980 to 1999. As of 2026, there are nearly 2 million incarcerated. Most are in state prisons. Here's a breakdown. 5.6 million are in the larger correctional control system. $113 million have an immediate family member who has ever been to prison or jail. And most people in prison are poor. Here is not incarcerated versus the income of somebody who is incarcerated. That's what this breakdown is. In 2021, blacks were incarcerated 6 times more than whites, while being approximately 15% of the U.S. So here's the U.S. average of different states. And when you combine them, you see 6 times more. How the poverty to prison pipeline funnels poor black people into prison in 5 steps. 1. Targeted policing. From 2003 to 2024, 90% of the NYPD's stop and frisks were of people of color. Black people are 3.64 times as likely as white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, even though both use it at similar rates. From 1986 to 2010, 5 grams of crack was punishable with the same sentence as 500 grams of cocaine. The same drug, different punishments for blacks and whites. 2. Higher bail. For similar crimes, bail is set 35% higher for black men than for white men. 3. Detained pretrial. You're detained pretrial when you can't make bail. People held are 4 times more likely to be sentenced than people who can make bail. Black men are 50% more likely to be detained pretrial than white people for similar crimes. Step 4. Harsher punishments. Harsher sentences. Black men receive sentences 13.4% longer than white men for similar crimes. 5. A record that follows you. A conviction triggers more than 44,000 legal restrictions across the country, blocking access to jobs, housing, etc. Steady work is one of the strongest things keeping people out of prison. And a record has 44,000 legal restrictions. But because a record makes steady work harder to find, within 5 years, 7 in 10 of those released are re-arrested. Many are stuck in a vicious loop. And that's the civil rights movement. Okay, chapter 13, modern conservatism. as it relates to economics. President Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 89, introduced, quote, trickle-down economics. Effective tax rates, 1979 to 1988. So effective tax rates, as I understand, is going to be the total. Effectively, what did people pay in as a total of the income that they made that year? From 1979 to 1988. Here it is. The top 1%, it went down almost 7%. The top 20%, you see here, what is that, 2.5%? The fourth 20%, it went down about a percentage point. For the middle 20%, a little over a percentage point. The second 20, the people on the bottom 20%, it stayed the same, and the people on the very bottom, they actually paid more in taxes. He paired defense spending with cuts. National Defense Authorization Acts raised the military by approximately $146 billion. His biggest omnibus Reconciliation Act, 1981, cut services by approximately $130.6 billion. 315,000 lost disability benefits. $1.1 million lost food stamps. 800,000 kids lost free lunches. As of 2026, quote, Reaganomics remains the Republican Party's economic framework, cutting taxes for the wealthiest and also corporations, deregulating corporations and industries, pairing military spending with cuts to social services. After World War II, wealth inequality was virtually non-existent. The rate at which a company grew was the rate at which wages grew. But in 1979, a productivity pay gap emerged. And we already looked at this, so we're going to look at another one that shows you income. So right here, and then Reagan somewhere here, he had a chance to correct this flat line. Instead, what happened is the income of everybody pretty much stayed the same, and for the top 10%, it rose. Okay. As of 2026, the U.S. continues to have a tax code that prevents middle class and poor Americans from obtaining wealth to pass down to their children. So you can see it here. The upper income, aggregate wealth, so just as a total. Upper income from 1983 has since rose out of the total of all the wealth that exists in the U.S. Those at the top own 79%. And then as that raises, this goes down from 32% of the aggregate income to 17%. This is data from when? This is 2016. Okay. As of 2026, the top 1% owns about the same wealth as the entire bottom 90% combined. Elon Musk became the world's first trillionaire on June 12, 2026. So while the US is the wealthiest on paper, most of that wealth is concentrated at the top. $6.9 million families of four made below the poverty line of $31,200 in 2024. $31,200 will serve as the baseline comparison. 153.7 million workers made on average $65,000 in 2024, 2 times more than a family of four below the poverty line. 500 S&P 500 500 S&P CEOs made on average $18.9 million in 2024, 285 times more than workers and 605 times more than a family of four below the poverty line. 2,769 billionaires' net worths grew on average by $722 million in 2024, 11,107 times more than workers, 23,141 times more than a family of four under the poverty line. The Democratic Party economics are divided into two often competing wings. The centrist wing, for example, Obama, represents an incremental reform. The progressive wing, for example, Bernie Sanders, represents more drastic reform. 2014's Testing Theories of Economic Politics studied 1,779 policy issues spanning 1981 to 2002. The peer-reviewed article found that economic elites and business groups have substantially more influence over laws than citizens do. That even when citizens did get the policies they wanted, they typically coincided with elite interests. Regardless of which political party has won the presidency since, this trend has continued into 2026. By 2025, economic elites and business groups had spent billions to influence laws for their profit, property, and private equity. And here you can see the number of lobbyists. Right now it's about 13,000. And here you can see they're spending billions of dollars every single year to influence laws. From what I'm seeing, that's $5 billion right there in 2024. Processed food and beverages spent approximately $300 million in lobbying, targeting nutrition labeling, dietary guidelines, and food policy. The U.S. is ranked first for obesity among developed nations. The pharmaceutical industry spent $6.1 billion in lobbying, targeting drug pricing, policy, and regulations. The U.S. is ranked first for prescription drug prices among developed nations. Gun rights groups spent $171.9 million in lobbying, targeting gun control measures. The U.S. is ranked first in school shootings among developed nations. The tobacco industry spent approximately $755 million in lobbying, targeting regulation and public health policy. Tobacco is the leading cause of preventable death in the U.S., 480,000 deaths a year for decades. And we get to the modern age. So that was modern conservatism. Let's talk the modern age. The modern age, as it relates to a handful of handpicked, quote, "thes" of many Americans' lived experiences. The internet became publicly accessible in 1991 with the invention of the World Wide Web. The internet marks a key event in the information age. It changed culture and commerce forever. By 2000, most Americans owned a household computer, and by 2013, a smartphone. By 2021, globally, most people owned a smartphone. The internet enabled asset-light businesses, software, e-commerce, social media, etc. to exist. In 1995, Amazon.com went live as a book-selling site. A little bit of nostalgia. In 1998, search engine Google.com went live. In 2004, the Facebook.com went live as a Harvard student directory. In 2006, the social media platform Twitter.com went live. In 2007, the first iPhone went on sale. In 2008, the first Android HTC Dream went on sale. In 2012, Facebook bought social media app Instagram for $1 billion. The global economy. The interconnectedness of countries' economies has existed since the Industrial Revolution. Globalization is the process of increased interconnectedness. For example, the maritime of the sea shipping routes play a crucial role. The internet plays a crucial role in the global economy. As of 2026, nearly 1 million miles of undersea cables connect the internet to the world. Here's the cables. Undersea cables were first used for telegraph, Morse code, in the mid-1800s to communicate around the world. They would send telegrams, that thing. A 1901 map of telegraph cables. After the Cold War, the U.S. slowly globalized its manufacturing using labor abroad. One pro is that lower consumer costs raise purchasing power, which is especially helpful to low-income families. One con is that globalization deepens the smile curve. The smile curve is the economic theory that manufacturing adds the least value relative to concepts and logistics, relative to concept and logistics. So wages for manufacturing are lower. So right here, you have research and development, branding and design, and then you have the logistics, the distribution of the product. And then globalization, the actual manufacturing, relative to the value provided here, it's the lowest. People are paying for the research and development, branding and design, and then the logistics of getting the product. That's the economics theory. Globalization enables a, quote, race to the bottom, in which poor countries compete to offer the lowest costs to attract corporate work, resulting in lower wages. Since heavily globalizing, the smile curve has deepened. So before the internet and before we heavily globalized after the end of the Cold War, this is what it used to be. So it used to be this before, but then it's since significantly deepened. So an argument you can make is that it's good that more research and development is being made. You could argue that that's innovation and logistics. We need good logistics. But it's coming at the cost of, when this deepens, this can go up. So instead of corporations making less money, this is coming out of this. This is deepened. Okay. When China raised garment workers' wages in 2010, apparel companies moved to Bangladesh, which offered cheaper labor. The, quote, race to the bottom results in few safety conditions. After the companies moved, the Rana Plaza garment factory in Bangladesh collapsed, killing over 1,100 workers. In 2001, Haiti voted to raise the minimum wage to $5 a day. The U.S. and corporations, for example, Foot on the Loom, Hanes, lobbied heavily against it and won, keeping the smile curve deepened. Garment workers make 0.5 to 3% of the retail price of the clothing they make. And here's a protest here. Coffee producers make 1% of the retail price of the cherries they harvest. phone assemblers make 0.1% of the retail price of the phones they make. Cocoa farmers make 3 to 6% of the retail price of the beans they harvest. Banana farmers make 1 to 3% of the retail price of the bananas they grow. Tea pluckers make 1 to 2% of the retail price of the leaves they pluck. As of 2026, well over 100 million work at the bottom of the supply chain. But some economists argue that globalization can lift countries out of poverty too. China lifted 800 million out of poverty. That is massive. From 1978 to 2020. Opening up its manufacturing to the global economy is in part responsible. Global extreme poverty, less than $2.15 in 2017 USD, fell from 36% in 1990 to 9% in 2019 and continues to fall. Globalization is in part responsible. Since 1994, globalization and the internet have largely driven corporate profit. The S&P 500 is an index of some of the largest corporations. Its net profit margins averaged 6% in 1995 and rose to 10% in 2020. Now, that seems small. Here's why it's massive. Here's the example. Because the revenue just went way higher. PepsiCo in 1995, the revenue was $30 billion. They netted 1.6, net margin about 5.28%. Now here's the difference of 5.28% to 10%. Pepsi in 2020, the revenue was $70 billion. They netted $7 billion. The net margin, 10%. The War on Terror. In 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 planes. 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers in New York, 1 into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the passengers overtook the hijackers on one, which crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 were killed. In New York, thousands of first responders and volunteers searched for survivors. As of 2026, 9/11 remains the deadliest terrorist attack on the U.S. And here's the Twin Towers attack during we see one of the towers collapsing here. And here we see after the towers collapsed. So definitely a tragedy. But what was a deadly day for about 3,000 innocent Americans soon became 2 deadly decades for millions of innocent people in the Middle East. President George W. Bush declared a, quote, war on terror to eliminate terrorism, especially Al-Qaeda. The war in Afghanistan began in 2001 and lasted for 20 years until 2021. But as of 2026, Al-Qaeda remains. In 2003, the war in Iraq began, primarily on the claim that Iraq held weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. There were worldwide protests, largely because it was doubted that they held WMDs. It ended in 2011. No WMDs were ever found. The Cost of War Project found that combined war on terror wars have killed 4.5 million to 4.7 million directly and indirectly and led to 38 million refugees. And let's just look at the direct numbers. So Iraq is going to be number 1, and it totals 800,000 directly. The Great Recession, 2007 to 2009. From 2004 to 2006, financial institutions on Wall Street, New York, enabled banks all around America to sell subprime mortgages to millions of Americans. These predatory home loans were designed to look affordable, but the terms buried the fact that monthly payments would spike later, often in 2 years. Soon, rates spiked and millions couldn't make their payments. So in 2008, the housing market crashed, which in turn crashed Wall Street and both the US and global economies. Around the world, tens of millions lost their job. Across the US, millions lost their jobs. So let's just look at some of these statistics. So the unemployment rate rose from 5% to 10%. Layoffs, 326,000. 3 million homes foreclosed. The GDP declined by 4.3%. Wall Street made tens of billions from subprime mortgages and collapsed the global economy in the process. But afterward, it faced virtually no repercussions. I'm running low on time, but I can do this. Since 2009, a housing shortage has existed in high-demand areas. As houses get more expensive, Americans struggle to buy. The housing market is also the root of homelessness, and the mentally ill and drug users are just the most vulnerable to losing their homes due to housing conditions. You see the pattern directly when you compare home affordability versus homelessness rates. So here is home affordability. Or here you see the West Coast, very difficult to get a home, and then a place like New York. And then you see right here the homelessness rates. Now there is some outliers, but overall you have a sample size of 50 states, and there is a lot of overlap. The Affordable Care Act. Republican Mitt Romney was the governor of Massachusetts from 2003 to 2007. His health reforms successfully insured approximately 400,000 people who were previously uninsured. In 2010, the number of uninsured Americans peaked at 50 million, plus an additional 29 million that were underinsured. In 2010, President Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act was passed into law, a meaningful step towards universal coverage. It has insured millions. In 2015, Mitt Romney admitted, "Without Romney Care, I don't think we would have Obamacare." What is both a Republican and a Democrat success story is under constant threat of defunding, all while the U.S. healthcare system fails millions. In 2024, 9.8% of the population under 65, 26.7%, 26.7 million, lacked health coverage. Man, I'm getting focus. Up from 9.5% in 2023. The U.S. is the only developed nation with pluralistic healthcare, a mix of private and public funding. Every other developed nation gives health coverage to all. Many countries with universal healthcare spend less than the U.S.'s pluralistic system does, while achieving better health outcomes. The U.S. has the most medical debt of any country. Medical debt contributes to 66.5% of bankruptcies, a problem virtually unheard of in other countries. Here's the medical debt as of 2021, $220 billion. The total of the government's and people's spending on healthcare is more than in any other countries, but up to a third is administrative costs, billing, and insurance, of which half is wasteful spending that doesn't go to people's health. Thus, high costs struggle to translate into better life expectancy. Here you see the U.S. and its peers by GDP. Here's how much the U.S. is spending to get improvements in life expectancy versus everybody else. Okay, The Iron River is the flow of guns to Mexican drug cartels, up to 200,000 annually. Since 2017, the cartel has been the primary driver of Mexican migration to the U.S. Approximately 80% of firearms seized from Mexican drug cartels originate in the U.S., fueling the gun violence that makes Mexico dangerous for families. Fueling the gun violence that makes Mexico dangerous for families. To enter legally, the visa wait time can take decades, so many cross illegally. And here you have the source of the guns here. So there's little crackdown of this. The Stop Arming Cartels Act from a few years ago, they tried to ban some of the more crazy weapons that you can just like shoot down planes with. And that, again, because of lobbying, that did not pass. So anyways, here's how gun violence compares internationally. So you see Mexico is third, way above the US. Instead of cracking down on the Iron River, lowering visa wait times, or giving a path to citizenship, the US is dealing with illegal immigration without humanity. In Texas, a 10-year-old girl with a brain tumor, a US citizen, on her way to an appointment with her family, was detained and deported with her family. ICE confiscated her seizure medication as well. In New York, a 56-year-old legal refugee, nearly blind, after determining he wasn't eligible to be deported, was dropped off in a coffee shop miles from his home. The temperatures were below freezing, and he died. Courts have ruled that over 4,400 ICE detentions have been illegal. The mandate not to hold kids longer than 20 days is often ignored. As a result, some hit or wet themselves from stress. There are also reports of moldy food. The mandate not to detain pregnant girls is often ignored. 16 miscarriages have been reported from 2025 to 2026 inside detention centers. There are ongoing investigations of rapes and other rape allegations that aren't even being investigated. At a detention center with 49 detention standard violations, guards were accused of a suicide betting pool. ICE agents routinely release critical detainees just before death to avoid reporting deaths in detention centers. ICE agents often impersonate police, enter homes without warrants, and don't identify themselves when asked, all violations of federal law. ICE agents shot and killed citizens Renee Good and Alex Preddy. There have yet to be seen any consequences for ICE's cruelty. The COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019, the coronavirus was found in Wuhan, China. It likely leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Due to China's lack of containment allowing people to travel, it spread globally via respiratory transmission, coughing/sneezing. In 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Americans saw safety measures like masks and social distancing, as well as widespread adoption of remote work and remote learning. The U.S. gave $4.6 trillion in relief to people, largely stimulus checks. Vaccines were produced in under a year, and in 2023, the WHO declared the pandemic over, that is the World Health Organization. By then, globally, the coronavirus killed approximately 7 million. The post-pandemic economy experienced a K-shaped recovery, with some industries thriving while others struggled to survive. As of 2026, the economy remains K-shaped, slowly deepening. As it deepens, so does wealth inequality. So you can see the tech sector, a lot of what it is the tech sector did recover and everybody else did not. And a lot of others did not. During the pandemic, while 1 in 2 people worldwide lost income, the wealth of the richest billionaires skyrocketed. So here's Musk before the pandemic and after the pandemic. Jeff Bezos and everybody else as well. Got much, much richer by the billions of dollars. The AI boom. Generative AI became publicly accessible in, actually we can see the total here. So on average, a 57% increase in their wealth. Okay, got it. The AI boom. Generative AI became publicly accessible in 2022 with the launch of ChatGPT. It can write, code, research, and generate images. ChatGPT reached 1 million users in 5 days and 100 million within 2 months. In 2026, it crossed 1 billion monthly users. AI chatbots will likely, as the internet did, change culture and commerce forever. And here's how people use ChatGPT. Practical guidance, writing like emails, seeking information, technical help, multimedia, other, and then self-expression. The Epstein files. In 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on federal sex trafficking charges. A month into custody, he died, ruled a suicide. Under a 2025 transparency law, 3.5 million pages of the Epstein files were released by 2026. Nearly 3 million are still withheld. The files document the trafficking and abuse of minors across Epstein's properties, naming a long list of powerful men, including President Donald Trump. An investigation is yet to be seen. And here we see, across the emails, here we see what people were talking to him. In finance, academia, his exes, media, tech, business, law, politics, real estate, and other. So a lot of people. The Middle East.
You're about finished up. We'll be closing in about 5 minutes.
Okay, can I have 5 more minutes?
Go for it. Yep.
Thank you. Okay, I really need to finish up. The Middle East, since World War II, from 1951 to 2022, Israel has been the largest recipient of U.S. aid at $317.9 billion. In 2024, President Joe Biden spent $17 billion in military aid to further fund Israel's war on Gaza, a genocide that the U.S. is funding. From 2023 to 2026 in Gaza, over 2 million Palestinians, Israel has killed over 70,000 and injured over 170,000 more, mostly civilians and mostly women and children. Israel targets humanitarian aid stations among other genocidal behaviors. Children with sniper shots to the head and chest have been found. Gaza has the highest number of child amputees per capita globally. Every Gaza university has been destroyed. Israel is destroying hospitals, starving children, starving civilians to death, and targeting mosques and Christian churches at times with civilians inside. Over 200 journalists and over 300 UN staff have been killed in Gaza, so the extent of cruelty is largely unknown. Approximately 5 million Palestinians live under Israeli control with no citizenship, no voting rights, and no state of their own. Since 1992, Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu has pushed the U.S. into military action against Iran. For decades, he's claimed they are close to weapons of mass destruction. In 2026, President Donald Trump, without congressional approval, along with Israel, started a war with Iran. And that was a handful of handpicked thes from the modern age, and there's just one more left. The end. Thank you for watching. I hope you guys learned something new, and I'm going to leave here ready to learn more, and I hope you do too. Thank you.